Okay, so you want to own a gaming studio. Find some talented people, give them computers, build a great game, and watch the money roll in. That is the version of this business that lives in people's heads. A creative endeavor that, if the game is good enough, becomes a money printing machine. And to be fair, sometimes it does. When it works spectacularly. But the gap between what this business looks like from the outside and what it actually costs to survive inside it is enormous. And almost nobody talks about the part where you spend 5 years and tens of millions of dollars before a single person can even buy your game. So let us go through the whole thing. What it actually takes to own a gaming studio, where every dollar goes, and why this industry produces some of the biggest financial disasters in entertainment. Not because the people running these companies are bad at their jobs, but because the economics here are quietly brutal in ways that are almost invisible until it is too late. The first thing you need to understand is what you are actually buying when you own a gaming studio. Unlike a restaurant, where you can point at the tables and the kitchen equipment and the lease, a gaming studio's most valuable assets are things you cannot see. The primary asset walks out of the building every evening and does not come back until Monday morning. What you actually own is people. Programmers, designers, artists, animators, writers, producers, testers, and executives who keep the whole operation moving. You also own intellectual property, the characters, the worlds, the storylines, the game mechanics that belong to your studio. And you own the institutional knowledge of how to build a game from scratch, which sounds simple until you try it and realize is one of the most complex creative and technical challenges in modern media. The reason this matters financially is that human talent and intellectual property have a completely different cost structure than physical inventory. A restaurant can cut costs by ordering fewer ingredients. A retailer can slow down purchases if sales soften. A gaming studio cannot stop paying its developers any more than a law firm can stop paying its lawyers. The moment you build a team, you have committed to a fixed monthly cash burn that does not care whether the game is on track or 6 months behind schedule. Now here is where the money actually starts leaving your account. And this is the part that genuinely shocks people who are new to this industry. The first bill arrives before the game exists. Before you have built anything anyone can play, before you have sold a single copy, you are already spending money every single day. You need office space or remote infrastructure if your team works from home. You need software, licenses for the tools your artists use to model characters and environments, licenses for the engine your programmers use to build the game, licenses for the systems your team uses to manage their work and track their progress. You need hardware, high-end development computers, specialized testing equipment for the consoles your game will run on, and servers for your internal development environment. You need legal services for contracts, intellectual property filings, and employment agreements. You need accountants. You need managers to keep the whole thing organized. And all of that is before a single line of game code has been written. A mid-sized studio with 100 developers. At a fully loaded cost, meaning salary plus benefits, payroll taxes, healthcare, and retirement contributions of around $12,000 per person per month, is burning through $1.2 million every single month just in staff costs alone. Over a 4-year development cycle, that is $57.6 million in payroll before you add a single dollar of software, hardware, rent, legal fees, or anything else. That is the financial reality of building games at any kind of serious scale. And the reason payroll is so dominant is that game development is almost entirely a human labor enterprise. Games are made almost entirely of time. Programmer time, artist time, designer time, testing time. Industry data consistently shows that payroll accounts for somewhere between 70 and 80% of a studio's total spending during the development phase. Everything else is in the remaining 20 to 30%. The hubs for serious game development are places like Seattle, Los Angeles, Austin, London, and Montreal. High-cost cities in high-cost countries. A senior engine programmer in the United States with 5 or more years of experience is earning somewhere between $140,000 and $185,000 a year in base salary. And that is before you add the full loaded employment costs on top. A game director or studio head is well above $200,000 a year. These are not numbers you can negotiate your way out of if you want talent that can actually ship a competitive product. And here is the thing that turns development timelines into financial catastrophes. If a game runs into technical problems, and they almost always do, and the release gets pushed back by 6 months, that is not just a 6-month delay in revenue. That is 6 additional months of the full payroll bill. For a 200-person studio at $12,500 per person per month, a 6-month delay adds $15 million directly to the cost of the game. $15 million that does not make the game a single dollar larger in the market, It does not increase the price you can charge. It does not expand the audience. It just makes the hole you have to climb out of that much deeper. This is why game development timelines are not just a creative problem. They are a financial survival problem. And the reason games take so long to make in the first place is genuinely fascinating from a systems perspective. A modern game is not one product. It is dozens of interconnected systems that all have to work together perfectly at 60 frames per second on hardware with hard limits. The physics engine has to talk to the animation system. The animation system has to talk to the AI. The AI has to talk to the level design. The level design has to be tested across every configuration of hardware you are releasing on. Add one new feature, say, a grappling hook for your main character, and suddenly your physics team needs to update the simulation, your animation team needs to create new movement cycles, your level design team needs to go back through every environment and check that the new mechanic does not break anything, your audio team needs new sound effects, and your QA team needs to write and execute hundreds of new test cases. What sounds like one feature is actually 20 workstreams across 6 departments, and those workstreams all generate bugs, and those bugs have to be found and fixed, and then tested again to make sure the fix did not create new bugs somewhere else. This is why development projects have a way of expanding in scope far beyond the original plan, and why budget overruns in this industry are not exceptions. They are the norm. The mechanism through which budgets explode is called scope creep, and it almost never happens because someone is being reckless. It happens because each individual decision to expand the project sounds completely reasonable at the time. Here is a real version of how this plays out. A studio greenlights a project with 50 developers, a $20 million budget, and a 3-year timeline. Things are going well in year 1, and management decides to add an open world structure because that is what the market seems to want. Now the map has to be vastly larger. That requires more environment artists, more asset creation time, more testing. Then a new version of the game engine releases mid-development with dramatically better graphics, and the team wants to upgrade because they are competing against games that will use it. Upgrading an engine mid-development is enormously expensive in time and productivity. Then the publisher wants a simultaneous release on both last generation and current generation consoles to maximize the audience, which requires a separate optimization effort for each platform. Each of those decisions had a business logic behind it. Together, they turned a 50-person, $20 million, 3-year project into a 180-person, $85 million, 5-year project. That actually happened to Immortals of Aveum, developed by Ascendant Studios and published by Electronic Arts. The development budget reached $85 million, with another $40 million in marketing on top. The game launched in August 2023 and sold a fraction of what it needed to break even. Within weeks, 45% of the studio staff were laid off, and the rest were eventually furloughed. It was not a bad game made by incompetent people. It was a technically ambitious project that got caught in the cost structure of modern AAA development at exactly the wrong moment. Before we talk about what happens when things go right, there is one more layer of spending that most people miss entirely. If you're getting value out of this breakdown, take a second to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this kind of content reach more people. Back to the costs, because here is the thing that will genuinely surprise you. Everything we have talked about so far, the year's salaries, the software, the hardware, the offices, all of that is just development spending. When the game is actually finished, when the code is complete and the final version is ready to be sent out to the world, that is not when the spending stops. That is when an entirely new round of spending begins. First, there is marketing, and not a modest marketing budget, a serious one. For AAA games, meaning the highest budget productions, marketing spending typically runs between 50 and 100% of the development budget. So a game that cost $100 million to build might cost another $50 to $100 million to market. Sony's Marvel's Spider-Man 2 had a development budget of around $315 million, and a marketing and distribution spend estimated between $35 and $50 million on top of that. Why does marketing cost so much? Because there are tens of thousands of games released every year across PC and console storefronts, and the people who might buy your game have no idea it exists unless you tell them. Repeatedly, across multiple channels, with cinematic trailers, events, influencer partnerships, paid advertising, social media campaigns, and launch week promotions. Building the product and selling the product are two entirely different businesses, and they both require serious capital. Then there is localization. If you want to sell your game in Japan, Germany, Brazil, and France, which you do because those are major markets, your game needs to be translated and voice acted in those languages. For a game with significant spoken dialogue, Localization across a dozen languages can cost between $1 and $2 million by itself. Then there are the platform certification processes. Every console platform has a quality certification program that your game must pass before it can be sold on their storefront. That takes time and costs money in both internal testing resources and submission fees. Then there are the servers. If your game has any online features, even just leaderboards or co-op, you need cloud server infrastructure that you are paying for continuously. And if your game is fully online, you are paying for those servers whether 10 people are playing or 10 million people are playing. And then there is customer support. Players have technical problems. They want refunds. They find bugs that your QA team missed. Every one of those interactions has a cost. So by the time a game actually launches, a studio that spent $80 million making it might have a total outlay of $140 million or more by the time the first reviews come out. Now let us talk about what actually comes back in when a customer buys your game. A customer spends $70 on a digital copy of your game through the PlayStation Store, Steam, or the Xbox storefront. That $70 does not go to your studio. Not even close. The platform takes its cut first. Sony, Microsoft, and Valve all charge a standard 30% commission on digital sales. Of that $70, $21 goes to the platform immediately. Then regional taxes, value-added taxes in Europe and elsewhere, payment processing fees, and refund reserves together account for roughly another 8%. What actually arrives in the studio's account from that $70 sale is roughly $43, about 61% of what the customer paid. Now run that through the full cost structure. Take a hypothetical game that cost $20 million to develop and $10 million to market, priced at $60, and imagine it sells 1 million copies. Gross consumer spending is $60 million. After platform fees of roughly 28% and tax and processing adjustments of another 8%, net revenue received is around $38 million. Subtract the $10 million in marketing, subtract the $20 million development, subtract a few million in ongoing overhead, and the studio ends up with pre-tax operating profit of roughly $5 million on $60 million in gross sales, a 9% net margin. On a product that took 4 years and a 100-person team to build. That is the financial reality of a game that sold 1 million copies. 1 million copies sounds like a lot. In gaming, 1 million copies often barely breaks even, or does not break even at all. The formal version of this calculation is called the break-even point. You take all your fixed costs, development, marketing, overhead, and you divide by your contribution margin, which is the net revenue you receive from each sale after platform fees and taxes are taken out. For a $70 game where the platform takes 30%, after taxes and processing, the contribution margin per unit is roughly $41. If your total costs are $300 million, you need to sell approximately 7.2 million full-price copies just to get back to zero. 7.2 million copies just to break even. Most games never reach that number. The ones that do not are the ones you rarely hear about, because they are not success stories. When a game fails to hit its break-even number, the damage is permanent in a way that differs from almost any other business. A retailer who overorders inventory can discount it or return it to suppliers. In game development, the money spent on salaries is gone. The time your team spent building features that got cut is gone. You cannot liquidate 4 years of programmer work to recoup losses. You just take the loss, and then you still have to pay the people who are left. The most catastrophic recent example of this is Concord, a hero shooter developed by Firewalk Studios and published by Sony Interactive Entertainment. The game spent 8 years in development. The estimated budget ran somewhere between $200 million and $400 million. It launched in August 2024, sold approximately 25,000 copies globally, generated roughly $1 million in revenue, and was taken offline 14 days after launch. Sony refunded every purchase, closed Firewalk Studios entirely, and wrote off the entire investment. $1 million in revenue against somewhere between $200 and $400 million in costs. That is what the worst version of this business looks like. But here is why people keep building gaming studios despite all of this. Because the other side of that equation, the upside when things go right, is almost incomprehensibly large. When a game genuinely hits, it does not just sell well at launch. It becomes a multi-year revenue engine. It generates downloadable content and expansion packs that existing players buy. It generates merchandise. It generates licensing opportunities, television adaptations, film adaptations, merchandise partnerships. It generates sequels that launch with a built-in audience. It gets ported to new platforms years after its original release. It gets included in subscription services and licensing deals that keep generating revenue long after the initial sales cycle has ended. MiHoYo's Genshin Impact launched in September 2020, with a development and marketing budget of around $100 million. Within its first 6 months of operation, it had generated over $1 billion in revenue and fully recouped its initial investment many times over. Several years later, it continues to generate hundreds of millions of dollars annually through its live service model. That is the asymmetry that defines this industry. A game can fail and lose everything you put in. A game can succeed and generate returns for a decade. The reason the upside is so large is intellectual property. When a game becomes genuinely successful, what you have actually built is not just a piece of software. You have built a brand, a world, a set of characters that people are emotionally attached to. And that attachment can be monetized across platforms and media in ways that go far beyond the original game's revenue. HBO's television adaptation of The Last of Us, which debuted in January 2023, generated a massive resurgence in sales for both The Last of Us Part 1 and Part 2 on PlayStation. People who had never played the games watched the show and went back and bought titles that had already been released years earlier. The original development costs had been fully amortized. Every new sale was running at very high marginal profit. One intellectual property generating revenue across multiple formats and years from the same underlying creative investment. This is the real business of gaming, not selling units. Building intellectual property that can keep producing across years, platforms, and media formats. There is a version of this business model that tries to accelerate this cycle. Instead of selling a game once and then selling you the next game in a few years, some studios have moved to what is called the live service model. Games built to be played continuously, updated regularly, and monetized through ongoing purchases rather than a single upfront price. You have seen these games. Battle passes, seasonal content, cosmetic items you can purchase inside the game, in-game currencies. Games like Fortnite and GTA Online and Genshin Impact are built around this model. And from a financial perspective, this model is extraordinary when it works because it converts what would have been a one-time transaction into a recurring revenue relationship with each player. Instead of asking, how many copies did we sell? The studio asks, how much revenue does each active player generate over the lifetime of their engagement? That is a fundamentally different and much more powerful financial question. Fortnite, developed by Epic Games, has generated over $26 billion in lifetime revenue since its launch in 2017. The game itself was free to download. All of that revenue came from players voluntarily spending money on cosmetic items and battle passes over years of engagement. But here is where the live service model creates its own version of financial pressure. A live service game is never finished. The moment you launch, you are committed to a permanent and expensive production schedule. You need new content every 60 to 90 days to keep players engaged. You need dedicated server infrastructure running at scale around the clock. You need security teams actively fighting hackers and cheaters. You need a moderation team managing player behavior. You need a customer support operation handling complaints and refunds. If the game underperforms and player numbers drop, your recurring revenue declines. But your server costs, your moderation costs, your support costs, those do not decline at the same rate. You end up in a situation where the live service costs continue while the revenue to pay for them evaporates. This is what happened to Anthem, developed by BioWare and published by Electronic Arts. It launched in February 2019 as a live service shooter. Player numbers declined sharply within months. Despite an announced overhaul in early 2020, the game was shut down in February 2021. The costs of keeping servers running and producing new content for a shrinking player base could not be justified. One more layer that most people building their first studio do not anticipate is the question of who owns what. Many studios do not operate independently. They work within a publisher relationship where an external company provides the upfront funding for development in exchange for a share of the revenue and, often, ownership of the intellectual property itself. The financial structure of a publisher deal typically works like this. The publisher gives the studio money to build the game, call it $30 million over 3 years. The studio spends that money on its team and production. When the game launches, the publisher takes 100% of the incoming revenue until the $30 million is fully recouped, plus the marketing spend, which might be another $15 million. So the publisher recoups $45 million before the studio sees $1 of royalties. Then, after recoupment, the remaining revenue is split, maybe 70% to the publisher and 30% to the studio. Two studios can build equally successful games and end up in completely different financial positions based entirely on whether they self-published or took a publisher deal. This is also why smaller, independent studios can sometimes be more profitable per dollar spent than enormous AAA operations. A 10-person team building a game with a $2 million total budget only needs to sell roughly 75,000 copies at $30 to break even. If that game becomes a word-of-mouth hit and sells 2 million copies, the profit margins are extraordinary, and the studio owns the intellectual property outright. An AAA studio with 300 developers and a $200 million production budget needs to sell several million copies at full price just to return the invested capital. Now for the single most dangerous and underappreciated risk in this entire business. It is not bad game design. It is not poor marketing. It is running out of cash before the game is finished. A studio can be theoretically profitable, meaning the game they are building will eventually generate more money than it costs to make, and still go out of business because the cash runs out 6 months before they can finish the game. Payroll has to be paid every 2 weeks. Rent is due every month. Software licenses renew on schedule. None of those bills care about your game's projected lifetime revenue. They care about the money in your bank account right now. This timing gap between when you are spending money and when the game eventually generates revenue is the most common cause of studio failure in the industry. It is not that the games were bad. It is that the companies ran out of runway. Even when a studio has a publisher deal that includes development funding, a platform certification rejection that delays a launch by 4 months can create an immediate financial crisis if the development funding has already been spent and the publisher is unwilling or unable to advance more. The most rational-seeming response to all of this risk is to not put all your chips on one game. The large publishing companies, Electronic Arts, Take-Two Interactive, Ubisoft, operate with diversified portfolios of projects at various stages of development. If one game fails, the cash flows from other titles absorb the loss. If one game becomes a hit, it funds the next generation of projects. This is a portfolio investment model applied to creative media, and it works for the same reason any diversification strategy works. It prevents any single loss from being fatal, but that model requires scale. You need multiple games in development simultaneously to spread the risk, which means the capital to fund multiple games at once. The catch-22 of building a sustainable gaming studio is that the strategy for managing risk requires resources that are only available after you have already survived the most dangerous period. So what does it actually cost to own a gaming studio? There is no single answer, and anyone who gives you one is oversimplifying. A 2-person team building a 2-dimensional indie game might operate on a total budget of a few $100,000 over 18 months. A 50-person mid-tier studio targeting a competitive multiplayer experience needs somewhere between $10 and $35 million to get to launch. A full AAA studio at the scale of something like Naughty Dog or Guerrilla Games? The kinds of studios that make the games Sony promotes as the reason to own a PlayStation requires hundreds of millions of dollars over multiple years just to build one title. The profit model, stripped down to its simplest form, works like this. Total gross revenue from all sources: unit sales, downloadable content, microtransactions, licensing deals, and subscription platform payments, minus platform and distribution fees, which typically run between 25 and 35% of gross, minus development costs, minus marketing, minus studio overhead and ongoing operations. Whatever is left is your operating profit. And the timing of when each of those line items hits your bank account matters just as much as the final number. The people who succeed in this industry long-term are not necessarily the ones who build the best games, though that obviously helps. They are the ones who understand that this is fundamentally a capital allocation problem. You are making bets across multi-year timelines with highly uncertain returns in a winner-take-most market. The studios that survive manage their cash position obsessively, control their scope with genuine discipline, and are ruthlessly honest with themselves about when a project is not going to work before they have spent everything trying to save it. Owning a gaming studio is not about selling games. It is about managing extreme financial risk while trying to build intellectual property that people want to spend years of their lives playing. Before you go, check out the detailed business guide linked in the description and pinned in the first comment. It covers a lot of the financial and strategic thinking that goes into building and scaling a business, and it is genuinely worth your time. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you. It means a lot. If you found it useful, please hit the like button, share it with someone who would find it interesting, and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. More of this kind of content is on the way.